Good afternoon. Is my mic on? Okay, no one's responding. I was trying again. Good afternoon. How's everyone? Great, glad to hear it. I'm Professor Chris Marsh in the Sociology Department. I'm one of the co-coordinators of the Critical Race Initiative, and I'm so excited to be here. For those that don't know me, I am a Fulbright scholar, and I'm actually in South Africa, in Johannesburg right now as we speak. But I haven't missed a symposium yet, and I wanted to make sure that I did not miss a symposium, so I took that 18-hour flight to be here because I really wanted to make sure that I was a part of the symposium, so I'm excited to be here. I'm really committed to the Critical Race Initiative. We're doing some really great things in the Critical Race Initiative, and just to mention a couple of things about the Critical Race Initiative, or CRI, I always spell it out, CRI, which kind of started by Patricia Hill Collins, and me and Dr. Ray are actually kind of spearheading the project now. One of the things that's quite near and dear to me that we're working on is we're working really closely with the Prince George's County Police Department. And I think in some ways this is like really novel work that we're doing. It's exciting, it's cutting edge, and I think it's really going to make a difference in scholarship, in the community, and in the police department. So we're quite excited about that. And we did some training with the cadets a little earlier this week. But both Rayshawn and I, Dr. Ray and I, our work centers around critical race in one way or another. So I'm actually in South Africa talking about the Black middle class in the South African context. And I plan to do some work where we actually look at photographing Black middle class neighborhoods in South Africa and juxtaposing that with Black middle class neighborhoods in the US and show the similarities and or the differences in how economically stable or unstable the communities are. So it's important that we constantly keep race and critical race central to my research, to Dr. Ray's research, and the research that comes out of the Critical Race Initiative. So by way of just how the rest of today is going to go, we're going to have a really great, engaging conversation. I'm excited to be here to listen to it. And then we're going to have a reception. The reception is going to be back here in this room, I believe on the other side of the black wall. So there's some really great food, really great discussion, really great people that you can talk with. So please be sure and come back to the reception because I do not want to take all that food back to South Africa with me. I think with that being said, I want to introduce Dean Ball. So Dean Ball is the Dean of BSOS. And just two quick things I want to tell you about Dean Ball. One, three things. One, he's just fabulous. Two, I appreciate Dean Ball because Dean Ball really supports scholars that want to do work on race. You don't always have people that want to support you, especially if you're doing race stuff. It can be a little slippery, it can be a little edgy, and you don't always get the support. But Dean Ball has been very supportive of any work that I want to do that centers around race and anything that comes out of the Critical Race Initiative when we're talking about race. So I really appreciate his commitment to the race scholarship that we do. The other really cool thing about Dean Ball is he really will just email you and just say, hey, how's it going? I'm in South Africa. He's like, hey, Chris, how's it going? And when you get that email line that says from Dean Ball, you don't want to open it. And I'm scared, every single time, but every time I open it, it's always so encouraging and something always just polite from Dean Ball. So keep up those really nice, polite emails that you send so I don't be scared to open them up in the future. So without further ado, our Dean Ball.
I had no idea I was terrifying the faculty, just trying to be supportive. And how can one not be supportive of such an outstanding unit as the CRI? In any case, good afternoon. As Chris said, I'm Greg Ball. I'm Dean of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you and those watching via live stream to the afternoon session of the 4th Annual Parren J. Mitchell Symposium hosted by the Critical Race Initiative and the Department of Sociology here in BSOS. Similar to the Parren J. Mitchell Art Sociology Building, this symposium extends the legacy of a man who was the first African-American congressman in the state of Maryland. Congressman Mitchell was also a Purple Heart recipient from his service during World War II. And vital to our university, he was the first African-American to obtain a graduate degree while taking courses on this campus. Throughout his life, Congressman Mitchell mentioned how social science research informed and steered his pursuit for equality and social justice. On the heels of the March for Science, which I attended, by the way, and it was a wonderful event, it is clear that we need more of that type of leadership that understands the importance of empirically grounded research for informing social and public policy. The Critical Race Initiative and symposiums like this one represent these pursuits. Research studies being done by faculty and students to reduce racial inequality, such as the partnership the Critical Race Initiative has with the Prince George's County Police and local churches in the county, very much align with the ideals expressed by Congressman Mitchell. So, thank you all for attending and watching. Enjoy the rest of the symposium. And I would now like to introduce my colleague, Wayne McIntosh, who is the Associate Dean for Graduate and Faculty Affairs.
Thank you, Greg. And let me first say that terrifying the faculty is supposed to be my job. So we need to talk. As Dean Ball mentioned, the integration of social science research with policy is important. We see this on full display today. The University of Maryland is part of the Congress to Campus program sponsored by the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress. This program provides opportunities for former congressmen and women to participate in university events, to connect with students, and inspire future generations to go into public service and enhance their civic literacy. It's a terrific program. I'm really happy that we've developed this relationship with the Former Members Association. It's our pleasure to have a former congressman to participate in the symposium today. Moderating this afternoon session is Mr. Albert Wynn. Mr. Wynn served as a member of the House of Representatives representing the 4th District of Maryland from 1993 to 2008. He was my congressman. Thank you for your service. The 4th District, you may know, borders the campus. It actually goes right around the edges of the campus. And my understanding is that Congressman Hoyer wants to keep the campus in his district. As founder of his own law firm, Mr. Wynn has obtained degrees from the University of Pittsburgh, Howard University, Georgetown University. He's a former director of the Prince George's County Consumer Protection Commission. Congressman Wynn spent a decade in the Maryland General Assembly, serving in the State House and the Senate. Congressman Wynn has been a proponent of equality, environmental protections, and the pathways to citizenship for immigrants. These are all really important issues. We'd like to think that Congressman Mitchell is looking down and proud to see his alma mater formally integrate politics with the social sciences. Congressman Wynn, thank you for participating today.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm kind of quiet. You have a heavy lunch? Good afternoon. I am really delighted and honored to be here. I want to thank you, Dean, and all the administrators and faculty and students who participate in this activity today. I do consider it a high honor to be a part of this, particularly because I consider Parren Mitchell to be one of my heroes, and to some extent, one of my mentors. You've heard of his great accomplishments and first, but I had the opportunity to sit at his feet. After I was elected, one of the first things I did was go and visit with Parren Mitchell. I'd known him, but I sat and visited, and I asked him about being in Congress, and he gave me some real great insights about things that were important, and he talked about economic empowerment along with civil rights. And so I consider him a guiding light, and the fact that you're honoring him through this symposium on one of the most important subjects confronting America today, I think is tremendously important, and you are to be applauded. Let's talk about today's program, or the panel, which you will find to be, I think, excellent, on the politics of racial representation. And that covers a lot of ground. It covers politics, it covers art, it covers self-discovery, it covers social media. And so as I was thinking about this, I went back to the founding of our country, and obviously there were many great and historic moments, but there are also some very dark chapters. The conquest and displacement of Native Americans, slavery, the war for Texas on our southern border. And then there was a phenomenon as each ethnic group came to the United States, the Irish, the Italians, the Asians, there were consistent patterns of discrimination. And then another dark moment, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. So while we talk about the greatness of America, we also have to recognize that there are blemishes and there are flaws and faults. But despite these painful episodes, we actually emerged and created the most heterogeneous country in the world. And that should not be taken for granted, because as you go around the globe and you look at various countries, you will rarely find, if ever, the degree of diversity that exists in the United States. At one point, everybody was so proud of this that they called it a great melting pot. But after further reflection, people begin to, as human nature will, think in terms of their own individuality, their own culture, their own identity. And as a result, I think the concept of America as a quilt began to evolve. Many cultures, many colors, many textures to that quilt or tapestry. And each group was making significant contributions to American society. And also, each group was seeking to be included and accurately represented in the public realm, what people now call authenticity. Is it an accurate representation? Do we have diversity? Do we have inclusion? And do we have authenticity? This has been a challenging task. This country's moved through the Jim Crow era, to the civil rights struggle, to the age of diversity, to the election of the first African-American president, and the dream of a post-racial society, only to be hit with the harsh realities of unjustified violence against people of color. And now we realize the continuing strain of racism in America that was exposed in the recent election. Today we're going to talk about these things. We're going to explore this issue in more depth, and we have a great panel as we look at the politics of racial representation, inclusion, diversion, however you care to characterize it. Because there are fundamental questions that we ought to think about. Are we seeing some of the old stereotypes or new stereotypes, even at a time of unprecedented media technological expansion and the growth of social media? So there are a couple questions. How are people of color represented in the media, politics, and other public realms? Why does this matter? Why is it important? For politics, for voting, for activism, for inclusion. We'll be talking about this, and I'm excited to get started. So what I'd like to do now is introduce each of our panelists, have them come up, and then we're going to engage in a little Q&A. We're going to watch some clips and react to some clips, and then we're going to have some questions from you, the audience, and we're going to try to keep this going and make it a very interesting afternoon. So let's get started. Our first panelist I'd like to bring up is Mr. Kevin Blackistone. He's an award-winning national sports columnist, now at the Washington Post and the University of Maryland. And many of you may have seen him on TV. That's where I see him all the time, on ESPN's Around the Horn. Kevin, welcome. I'm glad to have you here. Now, I saw Kevin earlier, so I knew he was here. But next we have Matthew W. Hughey. He's an associate professor of sociology at the University of Connecticut. His research concentrates on white racial identity, radicalized organizations, mass media, and political engagements. He's the author of 7 books, including the White Savior film, Content, Critics, and Consumption. Mr. Hughey? I think that probably should that be Dr. Hughey? It is. Wait a minute, Dr. Hughey, excuse me. Hey, you work for that. We certainly don't want to diminish it. Thank you for being here with us today. Next, we have Carmen R. Lugo-Lugo, a professor in the Department of Critical Culture, Gender, and Race Studies at Washington State University. She is co-author of Projecting 9/11, Race, Gender, and Citizenship in Recent Hollywood Films, and also another book containing un-American bodies, race, sexuality, and post-9/11 constructions of citizenship. She is an editor and contributor to the academic blog Meharris Talk. How you doing? Welcome. And finally, we're joined by Janelle Wong, Director of the Asian American Studies program here at the University of Maryland and author of Democracy's Promise, Immigrants and American Civic Institutions. She is co-principal investigator on the 2016 National Asian American Survey, a survey of Asian American political and social attitudes. So welcome one and all. All right, we're off. Kevin, let's start with you. How has the conversation around race and sport evolved during your career, from the days of O.J. or Jim Brown to Michael Vick to Colin Kaepernick? And what have you seen in terms of this evolution?
Well, the first thing I always think about, is this mic on? I hope it is. And I don't want to usurp what I'm going to say later on, but sport has been a lens through which so much of America has come to know the black community and black males in particular, because our society is so segregated, but the television lens, the broadcast lens, newspapers, if they haven't covered anything about black folks, they have covered black folks on the athletic field. And I think a great deal of that has been to our disservice, certainly to black males, because I think we have been couched in certain terms. I think we've been seen in a certain light, and I think it's been problematic from the very beginning up until what we see today. And I've been really focused in the last few years, I think, on what's been going on in terms of college campuses and the roles of black males in generating all the income for the college athletic industrial complex and what they have received as remuneration. And that's very problematic, and how they are viewed on college campuses. And so I think that sports journalism has really created an image of black males that is troubling in this society.
I would press you on specifics, but I think I'll wait. We'll come back to that one, because that's one that I'm particularly interested in, and I agree with your assessment. But I want to keep moving, and I want to talk to Dr. Hughey and ask you a question. You wrote a book, The White Savior Film, and you talk about how these white savior films and the protagonists in them are idealized white Americans to the extent that they come to perpetuate, in some instances, racism. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What's a white savior film, and do you agree that it has the effect of perpetuating racism?
Well, I'll start with the second first, because yes, and that's why I wrote the book, right?
All right.
Because to me, you can't talk about race without talking about racism, right? And to do so is, I think, both intellectually and morally dishonest, right? Because it's the very thing that we call racism that gave birth to this thing that we call race. That is, the two are co-constitutive. They reform and reform one another over and over again. So by the white savior film, I mean that you often have this white character, this person racialized as white, who goes into some community that is full of dark others. Often African Americans, sometimes Latinos, Hispanics, sometimes Asians, but often goes into the specter of blackness, right? And tries to save communities of color. Save them from whom? Themselves. Because we pathologize and we demonize communities of color, so that the problem with blackness is black folks. The problem with Latino-ness is Latinos, right? In that we pathologize groups of color as somehow not being white or right enough. So that all the character basically has to do is go into these communities and somehow remove generally a character, whether it's a black football player in Mississippi who has to be taught how to play football by a young white kid, right? Because that makes sense if you don't think about it. right? Or if it's, telling a story of, how modern genetic and medicine advances have occurred because of the cells of a young black woman that were unfairly taken from her, and that story is told by a white journalist, right? So, okay, is this thing on? Okay. So you have this white savior character who's going off and into these communities, taking someone away from their communities, and that somehow is some moral great thing. Cue the violin playing in the sentimental story, where we feel really good, at least we're told to feel really good about that tale. And these films do very well when it comes to Oscars, Golden Globes, and their accolades by critics in the industry.
Okay. So I guess Tarzan would fit in that category?
Oh, yeah.
I'm old enough to recall the early Tarzan movies. This recent one was not the first. And I was like, gee, that's kind of strange. This guy's coming through just taking over. How does that work? At any rate, I want to ask real quick about another book you wrote called Whitebound. You follow two white organizations. I think one is anti-racist and one is racist, or how would you characterize that? Because I was fascinated when I read the information they sent about it.
Yeah, so a lot of my work has been, Toni Morrison was mentioned earlier, and Toni Morrison talked about flipping the gaze, right, and making the people who usually describe them, right? So a lot of my work has been talking about white people and talking about whiteness. And as a white person, I'm able to get into a lot of communities and conversations where that occurs that a lot of folks of color wouldn't be able to get into, right? So I use my positionality to be able to do that. So in Whitebound, I hung out with, I did an ethnographic study, as we'll say in academia, for a year and a half with a white nationalist organization, and a year and a half with a white anti-racist organization. And speaking to this earlier point about comparativeness, I didn't actually want to do a comparative study. I wanted to criticize the so-called white liberal left who often thinks they're immune from racism, as if everything that white folks do simply because they want to help or because they think they got it right, they're doing right. But because I'm a sociologist, people said, we should really do a comparative project. So I did a comparative project with a group that couldn't possibly be the same as them, white supremacists. And guess what? There's a lot of similarities between how they make sense of whiteness. Are their politics different? Yes. Are their worldviews different? Yes. But we know that already. What we didn't know is how they make sense of and understand whiteness, specifically in relation to people of color, and again, especially black folks.
Okay. Well, I want to move on now to Dr. Lugo.
Yes.
One of the things that I've been curious about is this whole immigration citizenship issue, and we'll talk more about this. But the question I have is, how are ideas of citizenship and belonging constructed on screen and in other media? What does that mean, this whole citizenship and belonging, and how is it defined for good or ill?
I think there's been a continuity. Is this on? Sounds weird. There's been a continuity throughout the decades in Hollywood in constructing citizenship in very specific ways. But I also think that that's changed lately in the last, I would say, 15 to 20 years, especially after 9/11 hit. But that construction has been very clear throughout, which is, citizenship equals whiteness, or whiteness, I guess, equals citizenship, however you want to put that in whatever order. And whiteness and citizenship belong in the country. The thing about it lately is that what's constructed as who doesn't belong in the country, who doesn't belong in the country has expanded a bit. In terms of the focus, I would say, for instance, if you go to films from the 50s and the 60s and even the 70s, you see a contrast in terms of who belongs, who's a citizen, right, white, of course, and then who doesn't, and that who doesn't usually used to be black. And like I said, lately I've seen that expanding quite a bit. And the expansion now includes all sorts of people who are seen as not belonging in the country, as not being citizens, and of course as not being white.
What's what is the relationship between the depictions of, for example, the Latino community and other marginalized groups within the popular culture in terms of citizenship, belonging, that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. The constructions of Latinos have been pretty consistent throughout, and that's, I mean, the representations are usually very cohesive in how they portray Latinos as not being part of the country, not being citizens, not belonging. It's really interesting how those depictions have endured for so long, even when, you know, census tells you now, or the census tells you now that a great percentage of Latinos are actually born in the or have been born in the country, that they are second, third, fourth generation, right, Americans. But that perception of Latino-ness as, or Latinos as being belonging outside of the country still endures, and it's pretty persistent, I guess.
Okay, all right. Now, Dr. Wong, our hostess, I wanted to ask you, I guess, a similar question, but I'll phrase it this way. There are often misconceptions about Asian Americans and politics. So what should we know about Asian American political involvement and social attitudes in the context of this discussion?
Thanks for that question. And it's a real honor to have you here, Congressman Nguyen. So thank you for joining us and for serving as moderator. And I also wanted to thank the Critical Race Initiative for organizing this great day. So I think, you know, how are Asian Americans represented in politics? This gets to this issue of, I think, how the media relates to how we understand politics. So the images we see are mostly of what we call in Asian American studies the model minority or the perpetual foreigner, right? So that means that politicians often think that what Asian Americans care about are either good grades and excelling in education or immigration policy. And that means that we miss something about Asian Americans. We miss that every group cares about education, not just Asian Americans, and that what Asian Americans care about, what sets them apart from other groups in the US, are things like real support for universal health care, or gun control, or environmental concerns, or Asian Americans love big government, for instance, but nobody ever thinks about that. Nobody ever thinks about Asian Americans as, like, when was the last time you saw a media image of an Asian American environmentalist, right? But when was the last time you saw a media image of an Asian American student? So I think that's how we see the two, the media representation and politics, that representation really distorting our view of how race works in politics.
Would you go so far as to say that that's become a stereotype?
Definitely that's a stereotype that then affects even how our elected representatives think about what interests are. And this isn't just true for Asian Americans, right? It's also true for other groups as well. So I was thinking about this panel today and thinking about the media fetishization of the white working class voter, right? Mm-hmm. How many of you are familiar with that voter, right? A white voter, hasn't gone to college, and voted for Trump. He voted for Trump because it's almost always a he, right? And that voter has lost hope in, like, the middle class dream, right? We know that voter from this constant media image. But what we don't know, because we're so bombarded with this image, is that economic concerns did not drive working class white voters to Trump. It was racism and sexism. There are a lot of political science studies now that show racism and sexism predicted Trump support among white working class voters more than concerns over the economy. So I think, yes, these stereotypes matter in really complicated ways.
Okay, all right. Well, I think we've got some clips that we want to show to kind of flesh this out a little bit. So why don't we start with that? And
what will you do the next time you hear there's been a major terrorist attack? Chances chances are you'll turn on a TV.
Possible terror attack.
And specifically cable news.
And apparently there's been an explosion.
If it's a big attack, you'll watch hours of coverage over the next few days.
It's emerging now as a mass casualty situation.
Try to find out exactly what's going on. It's a very disturbing situation.
You'll learn excruciating details about the attack.
We don't know the extent of the injuries.
Haven't seen anything like it in my life.
See images of it replayed dozens of times. Watch sensationalized segments about how it happened, what our response should be.
We need to close our borders.
And when the next attack might come.
This kind of tragedy will not be the last one of its kind.
Watching this will make you feel scared, stressed, and anxious.
Could the U.S. be next?
But you'll keep watching anyway. Most people find terrorism coverage almost impossible to turn off.
We watch news like this because we want to be informed about potential threats to our safety.
Could what happened in Paris happen in the U.S.?
But what if it does the opposite? What if watching terrorism coverage makes us worse at knowing how to keep ourselves safe? One basic problem with how we understand scary news is that our brains care a lot more about stories than they do about statistics.
We're not very good at math, so we often judge the severity of a risk by how often we encounter it.
That's Bruce Schneier. He's a security expert who's written a lot about why our brains overreact to scary news stories.
And those stories stick to us more than the data does, so we make risk decisions more based on the stories than a reality.
So if we see a bunch of stories about shark attacks, we think shark attacks are common. If we see a story about a plane crash, we will overestimate the risks of flying. We don't do this because we're dumb, it's a basic psychology problem.
News, by definition, is something that almost never happens. But that's not the way our brains work. If it's in the news, if it's talked about, if we hear about it a lot, we confuse that with it being common.
And you can see this problem most clearly when it comes to terrorism. The chances of you or someone you know dying from terrorism are virtually zero. Terrorism looks scary, but it kills a shockingly low number of Americans. You are way less likely to die from terrorism than you are from choking on food while watching TV. That being said, after 9/11, Americans consumed a ton of extreme, shocking news coverage about terrorism, and our fear that we would be killed by terrorists spiked. Now you'd think as time went on and we went years without another 9/11, that our fears of terrorism would go down, the same way they went down after the Oklahoma City bombing, for example. But they didn't. We stayed scared. And you only need to turn on cable news to understand why.
Terror in the streets of Paris.
We have not ruled out terrorism.
Digital terrorism, homegrown terrorists.
TV news is packed with round-the-clock coverage of the war on terror, footage of ISIS training exercises,
A violent new ISIS video.
Okay. I personally found that very interesting because it made me question my own reactions to terror news. But for today, I want to throw this question out to our entire panel and ask, does the coverage of terrorism impact your perception of others? Or do you believe it impacts the general public's perception of others? And
I think that's pretty accurate in how it depicts the relationship between the coverage itself and the effect that that coverage has on people's psychological state. The thing about it to me, though, is the person doesn't ask the question, why so much coverage, right, to begin with? Like, what's driving that? To me, that's what's interesting sociologically, right? What's making all these news agencies and these organizations keep hammering on the terrorism?
if it bleeds, it leads.
And yes, no, I understand that. But to me, the thing about it is that the media is not acting in isolation. Right, the media is responding to a climate that we have created as a country, and it keeps feeding off that climate, right? And that climate has to do with the restructuring that we did of our entire society, basically, after 9/11. We restructured the government. We created an organization, an umbrella organization that's basically, it was created for the express purpose of monitoring, of producing ideas about terrorism. We changed the way we fly, right? We created all these war efforts, or constructed all these war efforts. One of them that was so amorphous that nobody knew what it was, right? The war on terror. Like the war in Iraq, people knew. The war, in Afghanistan, people knew. But the war on terror, like what was that, right? But it was in people's minds for a long time. It still is. People still talk about it a little. And so all these things combined, right? We also have sites that we've identified as security sites. Not only things like Guantanamo and things to have places to house terrorists, but also sites themselves, like for instance the border, right? One of the U.S. borders has been identified as a security concern. So we've created this whole structure and infrastructure to foster that kind of constant media attention on terrorism.
Other perspectives?
I think we're seeing kind of the natural consequence of what happens when you privatize the fourth estate, right? That 30, 40 years ago, you had much more public access to the airwaves. If you just look at radio, for example, you had literal bandwidth that was set aside for public usage. There's been more and more privatized, more and more sold off. And when you privatize things, the bottom rule is, under capitalism, it has to make money. And so when now you're flipping channels versus 30 years ago when there were only 2 or 3 channels, or just flipping through the radio, right? You have much more conglomeration and monopolization over things so that everything looks the same. But this speaks to your point, that we've met the enemy. The enemy isn't the media, the enemy is us. Because we, in some ways, desire those very tropes about otherness, that we think that makes sense to us. So when the media is feeding back to us what makes common sense to us, racism makes sense to a lot of people, and it sells. And so, we are the enemy.
I was thinking about that because what you just saw, of course, is a mass media, but the rage today is social media. So it seems as though social media may be feeding off of mass media, which I think goes to your point, in which the story is then repeated over and over again. But any other thoughts from the panelists about this whole fear thing and how it impacts our perception of others?
So, the news not just convey information. It does, as you say, convey a real emotional cue, and that is, in this case, fear. And I'm the boring one on this panel because I'm the political scientist, not the media person.
I'm a political science major.
But at least what political science shows us, which is kind of obvious in some ways, but I think it's good to show it empirically, is that these emotional cues that we're fed, 7 hours or 11 hours a day or whatever it might be, really do affect our policy attitudes. So research in political science shows that as people are cued by this, and they consume this fear message versus just getting a message about a potential attack versus, okay, so you could have that, just getting the straight up information about an attack somewhere versus getting information that has a lot of fear cues. Those people who receive the fear cues are much more likely to be hawkish in their policy attitudes. They're much more likely to want to go to war. I can't think of a more important kind of effect than that.
Okay. Well, now, let's maybe let the rubber hit the road in terms of the Muslim community. And specifically, do you believe in I think Dr. Lugo mentioned the inconveniences and the changes and our flight habits and all of that. Does the resentment of that then translate to the community that's blamed for these terrorist attacks? Does that account for, to some extent, some of the anti-Muslim sentiment that we see in many communities? Come on, that was a leading question. It can't be hard.
Well, okay, yes.
There you go. Okay.
But I think it's a little more complicated than that, and that's what I was trying to kind of come up with. I was actually thinking about, there's this political scientist, Betsy Hartman, and her colleagues, they published a book that's titled Terror and Taboo, I think it's the title. And I'm sorry, because it's 4 authors. they talk about what they call the political economy of terrorism. And I think the fear of Muslim and Muslim communities within the United States is part of that political economy. And they talk about it also in relation to fears about security, which is what the video was about. And specifically, they talk about what they call the production of terrorism, and they talk about it in relation to it as production, as being fabricated in a way, but also production as a theatrical production. So they talk about it in those two ways. And I think that they do include the fear of Muslim bodies and Muslim communities, I guess, within that.
Is there a resentment component when you have to wait in line and take off your shoes and flying's not as much fun as it used to be? Does any of that translate to the Muslim community? Or do you think it's exclusively a matter of fear?
I don't know. What I've seen in relation to that we have to take our shoes and we have to take off whatever, is we'll do it because we have to do this, because this is about security.
Who do they blame? Who do people blame for that? Because we didn't used to have to do it.
I know, but I don't think well, what I've seen, the studies that I've seen about it, where people are actually being interviewed, they don't resent anyone for it. They're actually proud of having to go through the process.
Oh, I know different people. What I want to do, though, is the next clip kind of follows this because it deals with President Trump's immigration policy. So why don't we run that clip, and then we'll kind of continue this whole question as it relates to immigration.
Ending our workers also means reforming our system of legal immigration. The current outdated system depresses wages for our poorest workers and puts great pressure on taxpayers. Nations around the world, like Canada, Australia, and many others, have a merit-based immigration system. It's a basic principle that those seeking to enter a country ought to be able to support themselves financially. Yet in America, we do not enforce this rule, straining the very public resources that our poorest citizens rely upon. According to the National Academy of Sciences, our current immigration system costs American taxpayers many billions of dollars a year. Switching away from this current system of lower-skilled immigration and instead adopting a merit-based system, we will have so many more benefits. It will save countless dollars, raise workers' wages, and help struggling families, including immigrant families, enter the middle class. And they will do it quickly, and they will be very, very happy indeed. I believe that real and positive immigration reform is possible as long as we focus on the following goals: to improve jobs and wages for Americans, to strengthen our nation's security, and to restore respect for our laws.
Okay. I think it's very interesting because what we now have is two elements. First, the fear element because of terrorism. Now we have an economic argument that the president is making, that those others are not contributing. They're coming here, they're taking jobs, they're driving down wages, and so you have another reason to be concerned about those others. I'd like to get your reaction to that basic concept, and specifically how it applies to the issue of race, because most of those others, or a significant number of those others, are from different races.
So I'll jump in. It's true that the picture in the American imagination of the immigrant who's draining the system is perpetuated through the media. And it often looks and is stereotyped as a Latino immigrant, right? Latinx immigrant. But in fact, what those media images, again, don't convey is that, one, are these immigrants a drain? They are actually paying, according to nonpartisan think tanks research, $11 billion a year in taxes through both sales tax, property taxes, and other taxes. But also, I think they're not always Latinx immigrants. So we know now that the largest group of immigrants entering every year since 2008 has been Asian, not Latinx, right? And the fastest growing group of undocumented immigrants in the United States are Asian immigrants from China and India. And this matters because people have very different views. The American public has very different views of Latinx versus Asian immigrants. Asian immigrants are privileged in the American mind. They get more of a benefit of a doubt in terms of how people think about their draining the system.
Okay, let's follow up on that question though, because when Donald Trump says he wants a merit-based system, and he intimates that the people who are coming in now are not, quote, based on merit, but are rather freeloaders or drains on the economy, is he implicitly creating an image of certain people coming in, say from the Hispanic community, versus other people who would come in under a merit-based system where people who are scholarly and with technological backgrounds are welcome and others are not?
I think you're right, and we just have to look at the goals that he outlined, right? One was to improve jobs, the other one was to strengthen the nation's security, and the third one is to restore respect for our laws. So the implication there is that the reason why our jobs are not good for Americans, that we have problems with national security, and that our laws, for whatever reason, aren't being respected is because of immigrants, right? So that's the conclusion that we have to draw from the way he outlined his argument, like you said. And that usually points to Latino communities for certain. Also, if I may, I want to correct I gave the wrong title for Betsy Harmon's et al.'s book. It's actually Making Threats. So I just wanted to correct that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Does anyone else want to comment on that kind of immigration terror issue?
Well, I mean, it just really underscores the power of the media and the importance of our role, because what everybody's pointing out here is that the data doesn't measure up to the presentation that gets perceived by the public. So almost everything you've heard here can be disputed by the facts. And even if there were someone, and I don't know everyone's religion here, but if there's someone sitting here who is Muslim, the data suggests that the most likely person on the stage to have been a terrorist to take lives in this country over the last 15 years would be you. And so that's the...
Watch out.
So that's a problem. And I was living in the state of Texas when the federal building in Oklahoma City was bombed, and the reaction of our country to that terroristic event versus our reaction to other events since then has been notably different. And that's because of the images that we've created of certain people in this country.
No, I think also, if I may real quick, there's a bit of an irony in what he says about merit-based things, right? Because when you look at, he wants to talk about merit-based immigration, but he doesn't want to talk about merit-based citizenship, because if we did that, a lot of mediocre white folk would get kicked out, right? But if we're talking about something that's being merit-based, then we have to look at the fact that actually immigrants commit less crime, that there are actually more exemplar citizens than native-born citizens are. So we don't want to look at those facts, and it's too bad we also don't have merit-based elections. Shots fired.
But also, what is merit?
Yeah, what is merit?
We've created a definition of merit from this that is not at all all-encompassing.
Well, the thing that I find interesting, there are a lot of what we call in politics dog whistle messages in all of this about who has merit, who's a drain on the economy, and it's not overt, but the media is repeating it because the data itself said that after Oklahoma City, there was a decrease, but then it went back up. But it decreased. In other words, the fear didn't sustain itself. Whereas after other terrorist incidents, there was just a sustained fear, which suggests that if Anglos commit terrorist acts, you can bounce back from it. Other people, not so much. We've got another clip. Why don't we go to that? This goes into, I believe, the Kaepernick effect, which is going to be down your alley, Kevin. And I'm really interested in this one.
Kaepernick has caused controversy.
Because I don't do technology. So, of the two of us, I'm sure it'll come up momentarily.
Hey, Sean, pause it.
By kneeling during the national anthem, sparking a dialogue about race relations in America. Of course, Kaepernick isn't the first athlete to protest between the lines of play. There was the man who shook up the world. Boxing legend Muhammad Ali refused his draft orders for the Vietnam War in 1967 with his famous words, "I ain't got no quarrel with those Viet Cong." He was fined, sentenced to 5 years of prison, and banned from boxing for 3 years. Ali managed to stay out of prison by appealing his case and later reclaimed his heavyweight title. Just as Ali's stance became iconic, so too was the powerful image of sprinters Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the 1968 Summer Olympics. The pair raised their fists during the national anthem as a message to the world about America's racial inequality. The result? Smith and Carlos were suspended from the U.S. team and scorned by the media for being unpatriotic. 40 years later, a statue of the Olympians was erected in their honor at their alma mater, San Jose State University. And before Colin Kaepernick took a knee during the anthem, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf remained seated. The Denver Nuggets guard felt that standing for the national anthem contradicted his Islamic beliefs. When asked why he would not stand, Abdul-Rauf said, "You can be for God and for oppression." Despite averaging more than 19 points per game, Abdul-Rauf was traded following the 1996 season. Colin Kaepernick is only the most recent athlete to stand up for a cause. Even as fans burn his jerseys, Kaepernick has been joined by his fellow athletes, men and women, black and white, across the sporting landscape. Cap isn't the first, and he certainly won't be the last.
The Cardinals and Seahawks went to overtime tied at 3, and after exchanging field goals on their first possessions, both teams missed game-winning field goals inside.
That's not part of the clip. Okay, Kevin, and I actually saw you on Around the Horn commenting, and a lot of people say, "Oh, he's every right to express himself." Can you talk a little bit more, because you see some of the behind-the-scenes commentary relating to African-American athletes and when they take a stand and how they conduct themselves, and you kind of intimated a little bit in your earlier speech. So I'd like to open the floor to you to share some comments on
Well,
that.
first of all, I'll just say I know that was only like a minute and 50 seconds, but that is like so shallow to think that the history of black athletes protesting, started with, or last seen with Colin Kaepernick and began with Smith and Carlos. I'll just remind everybody that if you read Jackie Robinson's autobiography, he said that he could no longer stand for the national anthem. But if we bring that up, then that ruins our sanitized narrative of Jackie Robinson in this country.
42.
Colin Kaepernick has been a fascinating story and continues to be the story that just gives columns. The national anthem in this country, and particularly in sports, which, if you think about it, is really the only place we celebrate the national anthem, has really become an issue. And I've written about it and spoken about it a number of times, and every time I do, people call into the University of Maryland or ESPN or wherever I may work and ask that I be fired, and then someone has to stand up in my defense. But you know, this really wound up getting translated in a racial issue, in part because it was someone of mixed heritage who has embraced his African roots, who has physically, visually taken on a very black appearance with cornrows and an afro. And who I also must say, because we're following a standing panel of all sisters up here, really owes a lot of his political education to a woman who happens to be going out with right now. And so for him to do what he did in on the stage of the National Football League, which is the biggest sports stage in this country, as big as there is in the world, one which has made a conscious effort to wrap itself in patriotism and militarism and nationalism, and to appear to thumb his nose at that as a black man who should be happy to be so privileged to be given God's gifts of athleticism. People have denounced that. People have trouble with that. And if you think about the history of the black athlete in this country as property, when you break from that chain, when you remove yourself from what your employer, and that employer also being fans,
good point.
They believe how you should act and behave, then you become persona non grata. And that's one of the reasons why Colin Kaepernick right now is without employment as a quarterback in a league that has dozens of quarterbacks who should not even be in the league. You talk about merit-based. Right? If we look at athletic ability in the NFL at some of these positions, you know, this becomes very obvious.
Any other reactions to Colin Kaepernick? We'll put all the weight on the brother now.
I have something.
All right, there you go.
There has actually been academic research on Colin Kaepernick. Some colleagues of mine at the University of Massachusetts studied what accounts for this difference between blacks and whites in their support for Kaepernick. So, majority, about 60% of blacks say what he did was right, and about 60%, a little bit more, of whites say we don't agree with it. And they boil it down. They did all these statistical analyses, and it's no shock. You know, it wasn't partisanship. It wasn't income. It wasn't education. It was one thing that really stood out, and that's resentment against blacks. Measures of resentment against blacks totally predict support or opposition to Kaepernick.
That's a very interesting finding.
Or is it obvious?
I'm going to give folks the benefit of the doubt and say it was an interesting finding.
I think they also controlled for patriotism. So that, I think, would also be, you know, that's the key thing you would think explained it. It's not.
Okay. Any other reactions? I want to go to the next clip because I personally find this to be fascinating.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Rachel Dolezal gained worldwide notoriety in 2015 when questions about her race and ethnicity came to light. Even though she was born to white parents, she stated that she identifies as a black person and intended to live her life that way. Well, Dolezal was accused of faking her black appearance, a claim she strongly denies. And in the aftermath of that firestorm, she lost her job as director of the Spokane chapter of the NAACP. Well, now she's written a book about her life. It's called In Full Color, Finding My Place in a Black and White World. Rachel, good morning. Good to see you again.
Good morning.
I'm sure it's a mixed bag writing a book. In some ways, I'm sure it was cathartic, but now you're back in the spotlight again. Any trepidation about that?
Yeah, you know, the book was a difficult one to write, for sure. But I felt like it was kind of a little bit forced upon me as far as just the need to tell the whole truth about my life and the full story.
And how has life been? Because you were here about a year ago, and you were really honest about the impact of these revelations on your life and trying to find a job. You just had a baby 13 months ago. How are things for you now? Is it still as difficult to kind of put your life back together?
Yeah, it's still definitely a big challenge, but I'm 100% committed to providing for my kids and finding my way back to the activism work that I'm so passionate about.
You even changed your name legally, which we will not reveal the name, but why did you feel the need to do that?
I really felt like I needed to change my legal name in order to be seen for my qualifications and experience rather than just seen for the tabloid publicity that I got in 2015. So when applying for a job, I felt like people were just seeing Rachel Dolezal and not paying attention to the wide-ranging experience and qualifications that I do have.
What are you hoping to say in this book? What is the message you're trying to get out there?
Well, I really want to advance the conversation about race and identity, and I really hope that readers are encouraged to be exactly who they are. And I also really hope that in some way, like I said, I want to tell the whole story of my life, and in some way that is able to kind of set the record straight, because my life story was really warped beyond recognition by a lot of the negative press in 2015. So,
well, I don't have to tell you, you're still very controversial, Rachel, because a lot of people think, okay, even if I understand the fact that she has a ton of affection for this African-American community, that she identifies with the African-American community, feels a part of it, why say that you are, in fact, a member of the African-American community? I think that's the disconnect people still have. What's your response? And I'm sure you hear it all the time.
Right. Well, I don't identify as African-American. I identify as Black, so I am part of the Pan-African diaspora. And I definitely feel like in America, even though race is a social construct, and we've acknowledged this in academia and in science, there still is a line drawn in the sand. There still are sides. Politically, there's a black side and a white side, and I stand unapologetically on the black side. I stand with my own internal sense of self and my own values. I stand with my sons. I stand with my sister, and I also stand there really with the greater cause of challenging the myth of white supremacy.
It's interesting because you could stand there and take all.
Okay. All right. Anybody who feels the need to sigh, go ahead. Okay. Now, obviously I have some opinions on this, but that's not the point. She raises something that I want to pursue with the panel, and that is race a social construct? As distinct from, say, ethnicity or anything. Is this something that was constructed for other purposes, or what is that a legitimate argument that race is a social construct? Putting aside her motives and what have you, panel.
I mean, okay, look.
All right, now maybe we can get to it, okay.
So I'm a sociologist, and one of the tried and true, things about sociology is that race is a social construct, right? Sure, a lot of undergrads in here are sociology majors, right? Could you raise your hand, right? So you've heard, keep your hands up if you've heard race is a social construct. Okay, so people get that, right? But I think everyone uses that.
For the non-sociology majors, explain
that's
what
where
you
I'm
mean.
going.
Okay,
that's where I'm going.
sorry.
Because I think everyone says it and no one knows what they're talking about, right? So when we talk about social construct, the way Rachel Dolezal, or now she goes by a Nigerian name, but I'll just call her Becky.
That's the name.
Some of you got that. Some of you will get it later. Ask your black friends. Okay. See, you just got it. Okay. So when we talk about race being a social construct, I think it means we need to reframe the discussion a little bit to understand that when we talk about race, we're talking about a process of racialization that works in the service of domination and power. Right? And if we're not talking about that, we're talking about something else. So Rachel Dolezal can appropriate, just like blackness, the language of sociologists and say that race is a social construct, by which I think she means she feels some kind of way about her romanticized understandings of blackness as activism and wears that kind of like a mantle, right? But to say that race is a social construct means it's not just a choice or an ideology. That means it exists in the historical operations of institutions. That means it exists in the conflict interplay of interests. That means it works in the everyday expectations of interactional norms. It exists in all those different ways. So me simply choosing something or identifying with something isn't mean I've magically socially constructed myself into blackness. Her way of doing that is very telling, and the interview even pushes back on this and says, why can't you do that activism work without identifying as black? For her, she can't, right? And I think there's something really interesting and almost pathological there. I mean, in the book, White Bound, that I mentioned, I found that both white nationalists and white anti-racists kind of saw something lacking or dull or boring with their whiteness and looked to people of color to kind of use and appropriate and grab onto and touch to feel somehow more human. And so it's not surprising at all that she does that when both white supremacists and white anti-racists do it, right? She's just overt about it and has been kind of made into a media spectacle about it. But when we talk about then race, we're talking about it in a different way than I think she is, right? Because it's not the same way at all.
Well, when we say that race is a social construct, and by the way, I am also a sociologist, but I am in an ethnic studies department. So when we say that race is a social construct, we're not saying that things are made up. That, today we come to this room and say, I'm a Martian because I want to be a Martian.
Do you feel like a Martian now?
Right now, I don't. So the thing with race as a social construction is, as Matthew was saying, it is based on something. It's based on experience, it's based on interactions, it's based on commonly agreed, concepts that put people in different positionalities in society. And I think that's what's important about this. When racial dorsal first came out in the national scene, I think it's the best way that I can put it, people were saying, oh, that's interesting. A white woman claiming to be black, and I'm like, there's nothing interesting about that. To me, what was interesting was precisely the way in which she was able to capture the national imagination. I was like, what is that about? The fact that she was able to claim that she was black, not African American apparently, but black, and that people thought that was interesting. That people were giving her a space for her to do that. That, to me, that was fascinating as a sociologist.
Okay.
But I don't have an answer as to,
Well, I think we're all fascinated by, and I know I am, by racial appropriation. And it happens not only, this is an extreme case, and I'll point everybody to the interview she also did with Stranger, which is, to me, like, really revealing.
It is the best one.
It is the best one.
But, racial appropriation happens in so many ways, right? Whether it's music and art, whether it's athletics in terms of style. She gave me a jumping off point to talk about the city I grew up in, Washington, D.C., and the National Football League team that I grew up in love with every Sunday, and how we have appropriated native caricatures to feel good about our football team. And so I think this is something that that goes on in all walks of life, and something we have to really wrestle with. And your point is great. I think that's another media problem. Like, what, she was outed, which is why she became such a story. But we continue to be attracted to this outrageousness. And it's very troubling, but we also see it in other ways in the media. Just thinking about a sports thing, and this to me, this is racial appropriation in an odd way, but the continued granting to a particular former NBA star as a spokesperson for racial dialogue and problems in this country on a national level, I think speaks to a comfort level that people have with dumbing down this entire issue.
We've got some sociologists here, and I want to pursue a question that I have relating to this construct notion. Because, and I think all of you who studied history will know, there was a time when African Americans who were fair-skinned, light-skinned, whatever you want to call it, would pass. And that was designed to enable them to live in a certain way. And I'm wondering, and I'd like reactions, as to whether that reinforces the notion that this is a construct, that if you're black, there's a certain set of realities in your existence, and if you're white, there's another set of circumstances in your realities. Because there are cases, a friend of mine who's a journalist, you probably know her, who talked about her family members. She's got black cousins and she's got white cousins. She's fair-skinned. She said, well, my side went black. And she said, but my other family side out in the Midwest, they decided to go white. And that, to me, is what a construct means, that you picked a side purely for the benefits associated with it. And so I'm wondering, does that reinforce the notion that maybe this is, or at least part of it, is a construct? Because I've always felt, for example, that the whole oppression of slaves based on some sort of inferiority was just a construct. Same arms, same legs, same eyes, same red blood, same total anatomy. But people were able to say, okay, no, this group of people, because of their color, are inferior, and therefore we can enslave them. And so they used a different kind of construct around race to justify slavery. So I'm just curious if you see any of that.
I mean, the thing about that example is that it illustrates perfectly the fact that constructs may be constructs, but they have consequences.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, so in that case, I mean, we're talking about people's bodies, people's lives, and it had consequences. The fact that as a society, we decided this group of people is going to be enslaved, right? It had consequences for that group of people. In terms of the passing, I think what's interesting about it is passing historically has been about surviving. Yeah. Passing has been about surviving for everybody, right? Who's ever tried to pass in any context. This is not passing.
Oh, I'm not dealing with Rachel.
Yeah, okay, all right.
I'm dealing with the notion of, have we constructed something in our society and use it to measure people, assign people, divide people, whatever the case may be? Is this all a construction of people that has no relationship to reality? So that if someone from another planet came here, they would see absolutely no difference. We've got all these, and it's so important in our society, but someone from another planet says, what are you talking about? They're all the same. So I'm just kind of throwing it out. I want to get to audience participation. I want to raise one question before I do, and that is, and I'll throw it out to the entire panel, do you believe that minorities are represented authentically and fairly in the media? Another leading question.
No.
No.
That's where you're supposed to answer a leading question, by the way. But
well,
I will follow it and ask you, give us some examples of what because there's a great deal of acceptance.
I'll just tell you one that I use in one of my classes here that I won't be teaching anymore because I blew up the syllabus. So I'm going to now do a course on sports, protests, and how the media covers it. Maybe 20 years ago, a guy I used to work with and another guy wrote a book on the NFL. And I can't exactly remember the title of the book, but it was something like NFL criminals and crime, or I don't know, something like that. And the data that they used suggested that suggested that NFL players, and particularly black NFL players, were more were more prone to be criminals in society than anyone else. And it got a lot of conversation, and it still does today. But the only problem was that the data that they used and what they used to compare it to did not equal that answer. And then in fact, when you looked at the data, it showed that they were no more likely, and in some instances less likely, to be criminals. Nonetheless, that is an image that has been constructed by us in the media that continues to get coverage today. And after the Ray Rice incident, it was once again brought up. And it was interesting because there's a sociologist on this campus, sociology student, and I forget her name, but she did a paper last year on the coverage of assault by, I think it was sexual assault, or domestic violence. That's what it is, a study of domestic violence by celebrities in the U.S. And she found out that the coverage for celebrities of color versus celebrities not of color was significantly different. And a white celebrity was given an opportunity within news stories to explain away his or her domestic violence case, whereas a black athlete, and that was most of the celebrities, were not and were presumed guilty. So those kinds of things have real consequences for real people.
No, I'm glad you said that, because I've had to conclude that the National Hockey League has no domestic violence.
Oh, of course not.
Yeah, that was just my conclusion. Any other reactions on that question? Okay, how about some questions from the audience? Just step up to the mic.
It also relates to how Native Americans are also seen by other ethnicities as something to be romanticized and all that, and I would see in Caucasian trying to the romanticized view and not the actual view of the African American.
And you want to know? Give me your question again.
Okay. Well, I'm Native American.
Okay.
Well, I'm Native American. I'm Navajo, and I see this a lot with a phenomenon in Germany called Indiana. And I want to see.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
Cool. Well, when I see this a lot, I saw this a lot in Germany, and the idea of the Indiana, which Germans like to dress up as Native Americans as sort of a pastime. Are we just seeing, in the case of Rachel Dolezal, an African American version of this? Or is this what different? Does she actually believe she is African American?
Panels?
So I don't think she would like. I think she has romanticized this image. I mean, I guess I'm going to take you in a slightly different direction, which is and it goes back to your question too. What is troubling about Rachel Dolezal? On the one hand, she's seen as inauthentic, right? And that troubles people. But what was really more troubling to me was not even her romanticization. It was really the pushback sort of reified the idea that, oh, race really is somehow biological or in the blood. And I felt really uncomfortable with that pushback, like, oh, you all teach social construction. Well, now look, now you're wrong, right? Because look, we don't think she is black, right? But the whole way that her experience played out, her own romanticization of blackness, but also the reaction to her being exposed as white, I think did in fact show that social construction is very much at play. It shaped the whole way that we received her exposure, and the entire way that people reacted to Rachel Dolezal is about how we think about race in the United States. So I actually ended up thinking, well, it actually does show the process of social construction at work. But so many people, I think, glommed onto this idea that social constructionists are somehow wrong because Rachel, we don't see as white. Yeah, we don't see her as black. We don't see her as black because of our ideas of what it means to be black or white in the U.S., not because she's not actually biologically black or white. I'm taking you in that direction.
Okay.
I think it goes to, somebody brought up the Ijoma Olu article on the Slate. And I think that there was a part there where the author just made this really incredibly insightful comment. The whole thing was amazing. But there's a section there where she's saying something along the lines of, you know, the thing with Dolezal is she has the privilege of thinking herself in one way that's detrimental in society, but having that very society look at her in a very different way. That gives her, so she walks down the street thinking, I'm a black woman, but everybody around her sees her as a white woman. So they're gonna treat her as a white woman, and that's what really matters, right, ultimately. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. Whether she believes that she's black or not, to be honest, I'm not inside her head, I don't know. But to me, what's more relevant is the fact that it's created this conversation that's really weird. And ultimately, it really makes us face the fact that race is very real, even though it is constructed.
Yeah, see that.
There's something there that's often not explored, right? There's this relationship between social constructivism and essentialism. Right? And Rachel Dolezal will say all the time, well, I believe race is a social construct, but I essentially believe in my essential self that I essentially am, you know, black or something. It's like, how do you reconcile these two competing ideals, right? So it's a kind of bizarre thing, but that I don't think Rachel Dolezal, because of her romanticization of blackness as somehow politically leftist or anti-establishment or anything, would agree if, say, someone like Thurman or I don't know, Dinesh D'Souza or something like said that he was white. She would probably push back and go, no, he's not. He's an Indian man who just is conservative, right? And so it doesn't play the same way. There's some really interesting contradictions that I wish we could explore at the same time that I wish this would all just like go away.
I agree. I want to make one comment on romanticizing. There are two things that happen in society, particularly with the mass media. You've got the negative portrayals, and then you've got the romanticizing. Neither are accurate. And I think we have to be careful, because a lot of times we say, oh, we reject the negative, but are perfectly willing to accept the, you know, romanticized version. For example, that gentleman was an Indian American, Native American. And if we talked about the spiritualization and spirituality, and the wisdom, then people are happy to embrace that. If people were talking about bows and arrows and violence, people were quick to reject that. The truth is somewhere in the middle. It always is. It's not the romanticized version, neither is it the negative portrayals. And I think as people in society trying to search for truth, we always have to be cognizant of that, not to be patronizing, say, oh yeah, I'm gonna accept the romanticized vision, nor to be hated and say, oh yeah, that person's a that and they do this and the other, that and the other. Yes?
Good afternoon. Mr. Hughey, I wanted to add, you said there were a lot of similarities when you did the, you know, two opposites. Can you just give us a couple examples or kind of have a little conversation on that?
Sure. So you're referring to the study of the white supremacists.
Yes.
Right. So as I said before, very different political ends, ideologies, worldviews, etc. But we know that. A lot of the similarities had to do with their understandings of whiteness and of people of color. Right, so one I just mentioned, they both saw whiteness as somehow lacking, inauthentic, dull, boring, and needing some type of contact with otherness to kind of credentialize that. I call this a relationship between white debt and color capital. right, in which they're constantly looking to kind of reify otherness as something that can be grabbed onto, held, and used for a temporary moment before it's cast out and no longer necessary, right? So there's that. Yeah.
Am I allowed to like add a part?
Follow-up question? Yes.
Yeah.
I think you
so,
are.
Mr. President, really.
Like, okay, I went to this training, right? Talked about race, and so I have like, do you feel like if white people were more open to saying, like, instead of being white American, right? If you were more open to saying, like, my great granddad is Irish, or you know, wherever he's from, would that give white people more of a culture to grab onto so that they wouldn't feel the need to appropriate? Or like how, like, you know what I mean? Like, is that another angle to look at as far as ending racism? Or
I don't think so. I mean, but people have thought that, right? And so, and I kid you not, if you look back in the congressional record in 1974, there was something passed called the Ethnic Heritage Act, in which Congress believed on the heels of the civil rights movement and Black Power and La Raza and so forth, that white people had somehow lost their culture and their way, and that they needed to funnel money into public schools to teach white people about their ethnic history. So stuff like Italians and Poles and Irish and certain symbolic ethnicities became in vogue for a moment. And they still kind of are, like everyone loves to be Irish in the middle of March, right? So I think it's actually the loss of kind of some of these ethnic groups, but at the same time the loss, but the kind of essentialization of them as well. As if Irishness is a thing that is a very stable, objectified thing that can be grabbed onto and used to be like, well, I'm not really white, as they live in an all-white neighborhood and only date white people and only do this and act in very white ways and say, but I'm not really white, so I'm kind of cool, right? Because I have my own kind of ethnic capital to use. So the way it actually plays out doesn't work like that, right? The whiteness is very flexible and is able to still maintain power and superiority even as it claims to distance itself from others and use them and grab onto them as necessary.
And I think the other thing to remember is just when you talk about Native American heritage and blackness, you know, people will embrace Native American heritage in a heartbeat. Oh yeah, my great-great-grandmother was Cherokee. You never hear anybody say, oh, my great-great-grandfather was a slave who jumped over the fence, right? You never hear that. They run from that. So I think there's a significant difference between the two.
And I would just add, because that's a great point. One of the things, and to go back to what Dr. Hughey said, one of the things I think that white people do have is their ethnic background, because they will tell you, I'm Irish, I'm Italian. Wherever they're from, they can tell you all about that. The disadvantage I think we have is I can't tell you whether I'm from Nigeria or Liberia, you know, and that's my loss, that's my deficiency that I grapple with, and I think that is a distinct element of blackness, or at least African Americanness, that is not a social construct. That is a reality. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Hi there, my name is Michael. This question is kind of for Kevin. It's about Stephen A's comment on Colin Kaepernick. I know, just to reiterate for everybody, Stephen A. Smith, after the election, I know, ESPN, I'm a fan of First Take, so you gotta represent. But after the election, he said he kind of like doesn't agree with Colin Kaepernick anymore because he said, I didn't vote, and kind of like publicized him not voting. And Stephen A. took quarrel with that because he saw voting as the greatest way he can make change in the country, and says, I no longer agree with Colin Kaepernick for whatever he says. Anybody can answer this, but what was your take on Stephen A's comments and the situation?
I've known Stephen for a long time. I generally don't comment on what other people in the media say. I just comment on the news that's there and try to react to that. I wrote a column about my disappointment with Colin Kaepernick, revealing that he did not participate in the election. I'll just distill it down to what my problem with that was. My problem with that was that Colin Kaepernick protested during the national anthem because of the brutality, the police brutality against black men in this country that also was not being policed through the judicial system. And you had a candidate who is now president who ran on a platform which used as a prescription policing tactics that were declared unconstitutional because of their direct impact on the very people that Colin Kaepernick said he was going down on a knee for. So to me, that brought into question whether or not Colin Kaepernick really understood the political situation that he had dramatized. And so to me, you had to participate in this electoral process in order to reject the policing policies of a Donald Trump and a Rudy Giuliani who was advising him on that. And how you saw it manifest itself, particularly in the city of New York, through broken windows, with Eric Garner, with any number of cases you saw there, as well as the full-page editorial that Donald Trump took out as a citizen in New York against the teenagers who were wrongfully charged with the heinous rape in Central Park. So to me, that was incongruous, and that's why I disagreed with his position on voting.
As a politician, I'm going to add my 2 cents, and I essentially agree with Kevin. And I think Colin has the absolute right to protest in any form he wants. But the message that I want to say, or my point, not a message, it's just my point, is that I think you have a responsibility to go beyond mere protest, mere symbolism. I think whether it's voting, whether it's active political engagement, there is more to it than just the symbolic protest, whether it's taking a knee or whether it's 500,000 people coming out wearing pink hats. You also have a responsibility, in my opinion, to actively engage in doing something. And so I'm much more proud of the unsung NFL players who work in their communities, work with young people, try to do things that are constructive to help young people avoid violence or those type of things. And I think that's also part of it. But he absolutely has the right to do what he wants. But I think there's more to it than that. I'm sorry, ma'am.
Hi, my name's Simone. I have a question going back to Rachel Dolezal and the social construction of race. I want to kind of start with her example juxtaposed against a example that I've seen in my personal life. She, who is white, considered herself and presented herself as a black woman. And she was the president of the NAACP in Spokane, Washington. Spokane, Washington's population is 82% white and only 2% black. The other example that I want to give is about a personal friend of mine. I did my undergraduate at Morgan State University, which is a HBCU. And she's also from the same hometown in California as me, and she is also mixed race like me, but she is much fairer skinned than me, and on campus is perceived as white. She recently crossed into a Black Greek organization and received backlash because people didn't perceive her as black in our environment where pretty much everyone else is black, obviously. So my question is, just as much as our perceptions of other people and what race is play into the social construction of race and whether or not she is or isn't and should or should not be able to claim blackness, what part in that do you think the context in which those perceptions are being made plays a part?
I mean, I think that's kind of the heart of the matter, right? That before, as I talked about race as a verb, as a process of racialization that happens not just in one's identity, but in the institutions that made you and your parents and your parents' parents and so forth and so on. The dominant ideologies that circulate in any particular context, the interactional norms, race isn't a cognitive construct, it's a social one. It has to be played out and understood and agreed upon by at least a large majority of folks. So it's amazing how much in sociology, we've started concentrating on this when we're trained to like look at the middle of the bell curve, but we keep concentrating on this outlier, right? But I mean, there are interesting stories and outliers here, but I think the context matters greatly, right? So I too am a member of a Black Greek letter organization, right? I pledge Phi Beta Sigma, but not too many people think I'm Black. And I haven't gone around claiming Blackness. Now, when I lived in Jamaica, when I first got there, and my Spanish was fairly good, people thought I was Cuban. But that didn't make me Cuban. But I passed as Cuban for a little while until I was like, no, yo soy americano, right? So, sorry, lo siento, right? And so that works to a certain extent sometimes in some places to try to maintain something that then runs against those other eyes, right? It's not just identity, but institutions and interests and so forth is where the rubber meets the road. And I think that's where Rachel Dolezal gets caught and people accuse her, as you said, of being inauthentic. But that also shows the point that we are constantly looking to biologize race and to find the real race there. Race is a social construct that works through those social facts that do exist because they have real consequences on people's lives.
I would just add that I think it is very much contextual because I'm sure you recall when Donald Trump was railing against the Hispanic judge that had ruled against him in the case involving Trump University, I found myself really surprised to find that that judge pledged my African-American fraternity. And so it is totally contextual. I don't know what he claims one way or another. At the end of the day, it doesn't really necessarily matter. I mean, I think some of us are offended by Rachel, but at the end of the day, if it is a construct, and a lot of sociologists tend to think it is, sometimes it really doesn't matter unless it's applied and how it's applied. Anyone else from the audience?
Hi. I just wanted to bring the conversation back to the representation of people of color on screen. So I had actually watched this video where there was a roundtable of screenwriters talking about race, talking about their representation. And one of them made a comment on how he believes there aren't enough people of color who are writing for films and who are writing for television. But then there was another person who had said that shouldn't matter. People should still be writing authentic narratives, even if they are. Like, he was basically saying, like, a Black writer should be able to write about an American, right? Or any kind of narrative. So what is your comment on that?
No. I think that, I mean, I understand that writers are writers and they come up with stories, and stories, you know, are stories. But the thing about it is that with the issues of representation that we have in the country right now, and they're multiple and they're long-standing and they are historical at this point, we really need to be very careful as to who's writing whose narratives, because experience matters, bodies matter, and I wouldn't feel very comfortable with, for instance, a film that centers the story of a Latino family that's written by a white person. To me, that would be kind of suspect. And it should be suspect and it should be questioned as to the motives of the person writing, the context, the background, and I think that, you know, at this juncture, it still matters who writes and what bodies are written about. So no, I don't agree with, you know, anybody can write about anybody else.
Anybody else have thoughts on this one? On this particular issue, because I thought it was kind of provocative. Yes. I'm going to get back to you, sir. I just thought it was relative to this particular comment.
And actually, Jane, the version, the writer and showrunner, is actually a white woman, and I attended a panel with her, and she talked about how she related to Jane as a type A and as a woman. And I think that the problem is there's twofold, that there aren't enough writers of color, and that you can't actually expect that all writers of color will be woke, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. And then another thing is that white writers tend to make that excuse that, where's the person that asked the question?
Hughey?
And so, sorry, I just want to know where I'm looking. And so white writers like to use the excuse that, oh, well, I'm just writing from my experience, because that's what, what's her name, the showrunner of Girls, Lena Dunham, said, right? She's like, well, I'm, half Jew and half WASP, so I wrote these characters for girls, even though it was set in New York City, lots of people of color there. So white writers, in my research, white writers really use this like write what you know excuse to not write people of color, and they make up like practically 90% of Hollywood, right? So if we don't, if we say that it has to be writers of color, it just won't happen, and that writers of color often are not, they're not necessarily writing for shows of color either. So it's just we do need, we want to say that the racial imagination it can be researched, right? This is my argument. That there, and also consultation with actors, because I think especially in television, a lot of times the writers will work with actors and then develop characters according to that actor and write for that actor. So, but I do agree that there is authenticity that needs to happen, and I think that the solution is to get more writers of color into the rooms, because a lot of the good shows have majority writers of color in the rooms. So.
And I think that's it. I think the question should be take back to why aren't there enough writers of color? Because there's a lot of folks of color who write. So, so why aren't they there? So that's the main question, definitely.
Which goes back to my issue of engagement. It would not be enough to protest the absence of minority writers unless you engage in making that happen. Sir, you had a question.
Hello. So my concept relates more so to stereotypes related through the media. And my question was, do the stereotypes that are shown through the media reflect back within the community that they're upon?
Can you give us an example?
As in...
Don't be shy.
As in like black groups being overly aggressive and being related to crime as it would be shown in
Black
news.
groups? Are you referring to gangs or just group of guys standing around?
Kind of the nature of just like being generally aggressive more so. Does that affect black communities within themselves and not relating to other communities?
So do we internalize those stereotypes?
Yes.
Well, I mean, not that specific, but just in general, if the media is created by someone else and controlled by someone else, and they show an image of you that you see, then, and it's not true, then that becomes problematic. I mean, if you want to get back to talking about Hollywood or television, I mean, that's one of the criticisms, right? That this is the only image that black youth see of themselves. And so how can you be something other than what you see represented? And that's why there was long been and continues to be a concern about the breadth of images of black people that you see in media. And I used to be in a journalist, the black journalist group in Dallas, Texas, and once a year they would do a seminar for the black community, and I think it was called How to Get into the Newspaper without Committing Murder, right? And so, and I remember one time I had this thing about, we had somebody who did like a column on dogs. I said, why don't you ever interview some black people who own dogs and love dogs, right? I mean, we do too, you know? And they're not all just pit bulls on chains, right? I mean, one of the most heartwarming stories out of the Katrina event was this elderly black man who wanted to find his dog, and they finally got reunited, and it was a very human story. So I think, yes, you do internalize the images that you see in the media, and it's problematic when they are not accurate.
You see it in implicit bias. So there's a huge field that looks at subconscious attitudes, right? And we see that all groups internalize these dominant images in the media, and we don't know we're doing it.
It also happens with white folks, right? So we spend a lot of time pathologizing whether or not black people are buying their own hype about blackness, but white people buy the hype about whiteness, right? That is, white people are sold a story about a way they never were and a future they can never have. right? Which I think explains a lot about the crisis that is endemic to whiteness. That whiteness itself is a bit of a Faustian bargain, right? That if you're constantly told you should be so great and can never live up to that greatness, then who's to blame? Right? It's the immigrants or the Muslims or the folks, it's whoever that other is. Right? So I think, you know, the kind of representation of whiteness itself and the historiography of whiteness, that whiteness is this greatness that white people can't live up to be, is going to create this internal crisis. And the media is a huge part of that.
I think it's a very insightful comment, because I think it goes to why there's a sense among some people to put down African Americans, because I may not be as great as I'm expected to be, but I'm better than them. And so that is kind of a reinforcing effect, at least from my observation. More follow-up? More questions? What? Got other questions? Oh, I'm sorry, you in line. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi. I always found the concept of identity like really appealing to me, and I've done a bunch of like personal research on it. But I was wondering on about your takes on like why do we find someone identifying as a different race like so like off or like odd or funny even, because I heard some people laughing when we were watching the video, while some people are also perfectly willing to accept someone identifying as another gender. And I was curious like why you don't think that acceptance really extends to race as much as it does with gender in this like modern time.
Okay,
Good question.
I think it's because it's not the same. And I'll give you an example from what we just saw there. She said, because I have it right here, when the journalist asked her something about being African American, right? She said, I don't identify as African American. I identify as black. A trans woman will tell you, I am a woman. That's very different. And that's as simple as I can make it.
But do you think that would change if someone...
Could you stand up to the mic, please?
Sorry about that. Do you think that would change if someone came out as like if a white person were to come out and be like, I am black, like that's how I like that's who I feel I am? Do you think that would change it at all, or?
I mean, I feel like it's partly race. The reason we're saying it's socially constructed is partly because race is about self-identity to some extent, but socially constructed means it's also about the social forces that impinge on people because of that identity. So if a white person says, I'm black, but they do not experience segregation and discrimination, then I think they can identify however they want. No one can say that's not their identity, but others may not attribute that racial categorization to them because of their lived experience. Race is not just about self-identity, it's also about life chances. So if that person's life chances are not affected by their identity, then I think it's a different, it's part of what's going on for them. I see your puzzlement. What is it?
No, it's just so I'm trying to like think of a way to phrase this, but I mean, I guess if a man were to like biological man were to identify as a woman, I know women are also like not as like discriminated against as African Americans and stuff, but if they're not personally going through that hardship, if they haven't like fully transitioned, and people don't see them as a woman yet, like visually on the outside, even though they identify as it, isn't that
they still get pushback, right? And people might still say, oh, you still get male privilege at this time, and that shapes your experience of gender in a different way than someone who presents as a female.
And there's also a difference, I think, too, and here I rely on the Black feminist scholarship, right, that says that gender is much older than that of race, right? And the way that gender fluidity has played out for a long time, and in many different ways, and toward contradictory ends. Where race is 400, 500 years old or so, that is embedded very much with settler colonialism and global imperialism and white supremacy. So in some ways, patriarchy comes out of gender, whereas white supremacy, colonialism, and so forth made race. And so they're very different processes if you track power. And I think that's where people get kind of like they're not the same thing. Don't conflate, Caitlyn Jenner with,
And we're very defensive of our color too. I got to say that. When I first heard the Rachel Dolezal, I said, you want to be black? Go get yourself some hypertension. Go get yourself some glaucoma. Go live in a food desert where the only place you can shop for groceries is your local CVS, right? Yeah. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Okay, so I have 2 or 3, I don't know if they're questions or just things to say. One, I think it was a good point that you mentioned, like gender fluidity versus like, you know, like construct, and like how race is more of like a construct. Like gender is more fluid, and like you can't make race fluid the way that you can like with gender. So as we've been saying, like race is a social construct, but what are the things that sort of like entail that construction? Does ethnicity and like culture sort of come into play? Like are those aspects that come into race? That's my first question, because then that leads to my next thing. Yes?
I just thought of something that someone said to me once. It said, Obama can't be black because his grandma's not black.
Okay, so obviously there's a lot of flaws with race. So I'm not saying it's a privilege to even like have your own race, but if like race is a social construct that entails like ethnicity and culture, what about like Middle Eastern people? Like why is that not even considered a race to like be bubbled in? Or, you know, people of like Desi descent. And also another thing with that, if race is such a social construct, then how can you say people of Middle Eastern descent and North Africans, you know, Egyptians, or people who are Libyan or Sudanese, how can they bubble in white when it comes to race?
I think this is a wonderful question that really does show how much race changes globally, right? So some of those categories you mentioned are races in other countries, like South Africa, for example, but also have been races for a minute or two in the US, right? Because when we think about how we do race as a performance, the census has such weight. The state plays a huge role, right? So if you look at, you know, Chinese was a race for 10 years. I showed my students, you know, the census and how different categories come on and off. And I'm like, why just those 10 years? What was going on? Oh gosh, railroads. And we were using them for labor. And then when that was done, boom, right? And they're no longer needed to be racialized in that same way. So different groups have come on and off the census. And some people argue that even Muslims themselves as a religion is being racialized in the same way Jewishness as a religion became racialized, right? So I think if we take the long view of the racialization as a process, again, foregrounding power and domination, then we get to see why some groups are or are not categorized as racist officially, and then to your point, by context. In some small locales and places they are. In the South where I grew up, it's black-white. It doesn't exist that way in California. It's very different. Race functions differently.
And as we've seen Middle Eastern people, others post 9/11 becoming Desi people become more racialized, we see a new census category is proposed and it's being voted. There's a comment period right now, Middle Eastern, North Africa, and there's a debate because race is actually it is fluid. We see a debate within the Middle Eastern, North African category about whether or not it should be a separate category under the umbrella of race, and people can be, you know, how should, for instance, Israelis be included versus Egyptians, and so it's actually a conversation that's happening right now. It's not a sort of they are a race one day and they're not another day. It's really what is society thinking about as a collective, that group, and there's not agreement. So I think it's actually happening. What you're talking about is happening right this minute.
Thank you.
Just one little thing. Back in 1917, I think it was, there was a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court by a guy from India who had immigrated to the country, and he wanted to be considered white. Yeah, thin.
1924.
Thank you. So, and it went, like I said, all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court determined that no, that he wasn't white, but they really couldn't explain why he wasn't white. All they could say was that he wasn't white because the common man wouldn't see him as white. A year before, or maybe 2 years before, in Louisiana, another judge with another man from India made the same determination, and the way he did it was by asking the guy to basically roll up his sleeve. and show that his veins didn't show, so therefore he wasn't white, right? So the determinations that we've made in the country, that's to go to both points here. Throughout the history of the country, we have made different determinations about race, about who belongs and who doesn't in any category, which has been really interesting. I mean, think of the one-drop rule too in the South, right? And how it was. I mean, you could be white in Florida, and then you would move to Alabama, and you were black, right? So it just tells you how, again, weird. And I know that I've used that word 3 times already. Constructions of race have been in the country, I guess.
Well, we're going to wrap up, but I'd like to ask you to give our panel a real round of applause. I think they've done a great job.
Thank you. Thank you. This is great. Thank our panelists one more time. They were great. Let's also thank Congressman Wynn for coming to moderate this session, and for you all for staying the entire day. If you did that, give yourself a round of applause, because today was definitely awesome. And for all those people who are watching on live stream, thank you for doing that. There were several people we heard from the IT team here that this is some of the most people that they've had tune in on live stream. So thank you all, and that's great work of the Critical Race Initiative team putting this together. So for everyone who's still here, we are about to transition directly to the reception, which is happening right behind here. Free food and drinks for students. If you're under 21, drink soda. Maybe not a Pepsi, but we'll deal with that. And thank you all for coming out. And let me tell you, at 4:30, so in 30 minutes, we'll have a transition period. But at 4:30, Kevin Blackistone is going to give the keynote at the reception and be talking about race, sports, and politics and continuing that conversation. So feel free to socialize and come back behind here and enjoy yourself. Thank you all for coming.